When King Charles stepped before the cameras that evening, no one expected the words that would follow, words that shattered centuries of tradition and left Britain breathless. The air in the blue drawing room was thick with tension as the king appeared before the world, visibly emotional, yet determined. He stood in the very spot where monarchs before him had delivered countless declarations, but this moment was unlike anything in living memory. His eyes glistened as he looked into the lens, knowing that what he was about to say would redefine the monarchy forever. "Tonight I speak as your king," he began, his voice steady yet edged with something deeper, "and as a father." That single phrase sent a ripple of uncertainty through the palace staff, who stood frozen just beyond the cameras. There was no official script before him, no rehearsed gestures of reassurance, only the raw weight of a man carrying a decision too heavy for any crown. Around the world, television screens glowed with his solemn figure as audiences leaned forward, transfixed by his unexpected tone of finality. People in living rooms, pubs, and even bustling city squares fell silent. This was not the speech they expected from a monarch who had waited decades for his throne. Whispers broke out among royal aides standing off to the side, confusion etched on their faces. The cameras didn't catch it, but one aide reportedly mouthed the words, "He's actually doing it?" As the reality of the moment sank in. The whispers turned into quiet panic when Charles paused, closed his eyes for a heartbeat, and spoke again. His words cut through the heavy silence. "Tonight, I relinquish the throne not out of weakness, but out of faith." Audible gasps erupted from behind the cameras, but Charles continued, unshaken. He acknowledged his years of service, the trials of his reign, and the illness that had shadowed him quietly. Then came the words that would echo through history. "I hereby name my son William and his wife Catherine, along with their children George, Charlotte, and Louisa's, the rightful future of this monarchy, effective immediately. Their time begins tonight." The announcement was at once staggering and precise, a royal decree delivered not with grandeur, but with the quiet authority of a man who had made peace with his choice. Social media lit up within seconds. News anchors scrambled to interpret his words. Was this abdication driven by his illness? Had palace intrigue forced his hand? Or was this his final act of love for his family, and for a nation he could no longer serve as he once had? The blue drawing room seemed to shrink in that instant, as if the walls themselves struggled to hold the weight of his declaration. Even the most seasoned journalists hesitated, unsure how to summarize what had just unfolded. But one thing was clear. King Charles had chosen to rewrite history in real time, surrendering his crown to a new generation while the world watched in stunned silence. Yet beneath the graceful language and stoic face, darker truths and unspoken conflicts began to surface, hinting that this was no ordinary abdication. What would push a man who waited decades for the crown to give it up so soon? The answer, as whispered behind palace walls, was darker and more complicated than anyone dared imagine. For months before that fateful speech, King Charles lived in the shadow of private turmoil, a storm that threatened to consume him long before the public ever caught a glimpse. Those close to him say his cancer diagnosis was only the beginning. What followed was a relentless, quiet battle against his own body, against the weight of expectation, and against a monarchy struggling to keep itself intact. Insiders recount sleepless nights and whispered consultations with doctors who could no longer disguise the truth. His health was faltering faster than palace statements would admit, and every morning he woke feeling weaker than the day before. Still, the cameras never captured the moments he retreated behind closed doors, gripping his desk with trembling hands, willing himself to stand upright for the nation. But the diagnosis was not the only weight on his shoulders. Behind the scenes, factions within the palace began to murmur, voices of advisors, even family members, who believed that the monarchy's image could no longer withstand a visibly ailing king. Reports of quiet meetings without his knowledge began to surface, discussions about when not, if he should step aside. Some advisors framed it as preserving the monarchy's dignity. Others saw it as an opportunity to reshape the institution altogether, and their whispers grew into pressure he could no longer ignore. The unspoken truth? They were already preparing for a Britain beyond Charles, whether he agreed or not. To make matters worse, tensions with William began to seep through the cracks. Though father and son had always presented a united front in public, their visions of the monarchy could not have been more different. William wanted a modern, streamlined crown, shorn of unnecessary ceremony and accessible to the people. Charles clung to the traditions he'd been raised to protect, fearing that too much change too fast would erode the very foundation of the monarchy. The clashes became harder to hide. Every strained glance in public masked private arguments that left both men reeling. Adding to his torment was Catherine's quiet suffering. Her recent health struggles, barely mentioned in official statements, weighed heavily on Charles. He watched her maintain composure at events, knowing the toll it took on her, knowing how much she and William already carried. It became impossible to ignore that his own declining strength was only adding to their burden. Royal aides would later say that he often locked himself away after such events, weeping alone for hours, a man torn between duty and mercy for himself and for them. And so, in those final weeks, he made his decision. Not lightly, not impulsively, but with the knowledge that the crown he had waited his entire life to wear was slipping from his grasp. He chose to let it go, even if the choice was wrenched from him by circumstance. But even as the king struggled behind closed doors, he knew that passing the torch to William and Catherine would ignite its own storm of secrets and rivalries. When their names were spoken, the future king and queen rose to meet their fate, but not without casting one last glance at each other, as if to ask, "Are we ready?" For a breathless moment, time seemed to stall. All eyes turned toward William and Catherine, seated in the front row, their posture betraying the strain of what they knew was coming. As Charles uttered their names with solemn finality, William reached out, almost instinctively, and clasped Catherine's hand. That single gesture, quiet yet defiant, spoke louder than anything the king himself had said. In it was a promise, not only to each other, but to the nation watching with bated breath. A hush fell over the room so complete it felt suffocating, broken only by the faint rustle of silk gowns and whispered murmurs from stunned courtiers who had not expected the moment to come so soon, or so decisively. There was no applause, no cheers, only a reverent, almost fearful silence that hung in the air like a verdict. On the balcony above, young George, Charlotte, and Louis stood together, wide-eyed and still, their expressions frozen somewhere between pride and confusion. Even from afar, their innocence magnified the gravity of what had just transpired. Observers later recounted that Catherine's tears shimmered in the corner of her eyes, threatening to fall, yet she managed to keep them at bay. Her chin lifted just slightly, her back straightened, as though she'd resolved in that instant never to let the weight of expectation bow her spirit. To those watching, it was a masterclass in royal poise, but those closer could feel the tension in the air, a storm disguised as calm. And then came something no camera fully caught, yet no one in the room could ignore. A subtle, fleeting glare exchanged between William and Andrew in the shadows. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but it carried the heat of years of rivalry and resentment. Some say Andrew's jaw tightened as he averted his eyes. Others say he muttered something under his breath before stepping back into the darkness. Whatever it was, it left an unmistakable chill that cut through the solemnity of the moment. Still, the focus returned to William and Catherine, who now stood the future of the monarchy incarnate, their intertwined hands conveying both strength and apprehension. The room began to stir again, whispers thickening, but the couple remained unmoving, letting the weight of the crown settle firmly on their shoulders. This was their moment of truth, but it came at a cost that even they could not yet fathom. Yet beyond this polished facade lay an intricate web of envy, ambition, and heartbreak waiting to unravel. Even as Britain cheered outside the palace gates, not everyone inside was clapping. Beyond the gilded walls, crowds erupted in chants of support for William and Catherine. But within the palace, the atmosphere turned icy, a tension so thick it nearly silenced the room. Prince Andrew reportedly slipped out midway through the speech, his exit unceremonious but telling. Those who noticed exchanged uneasy glances, fully aware that his departure was no accident, but a quiet protest against the king's decision. His absence, though unspoken in the moment, was a crack in the foundation, exposing long-simmering resentments beneath the monarchy's polished veneer. Camilla, who remained seated in the shadows, dabbed at her tears as the announcement unfolded. But as royal insiders would later reveal, those tears were not born of pride. They were bitter, a reflection of a woman who had fought her own battles to stand beside Charles, only to see the crown handed to another. Behind her carefully composed expression, whispers say, burned the sting of being reduced to a footnote in a narrative she once believed was hers to share. Around the edges of the room, minor royals, many barely visible to the cameras, muttered their anger under their breath. Some felt betrayed, others humiliated, convinced they had been deliberately sidelined. their titles rendered meaningless in a single stroke. These murmurs, sharp, restrained but full of venom, painted a stark contrast to the public's applause echoing beyond the palace walls. And then, there was the ghostly presence of Meghan and Harry. Though absent from the proceedings, their shadow loomed over every moment. Rumors swirled that moments after the speech, a scathing private message arrived from overseas, its words sharp enough to wound. "A monarchy that eats its own." One source quoted it as saying, though the palace refused to comment. Amid the growing discontent, a few courtiers dared to question aloud whether Charles's decision was truly his own or the product of illness clouding his judgment. Behind closed doors, they whispered of mental strain, of a man who might have buckled under pressure and emotion rather than clarity of purpose. Their doubts were quiet but persistent, adding another layer of suspicion to an already fractured scene. Those who remained in the room after the camera cut described the atmosphere in chilling terms. "Glacial," one aide confessed. Another said the walls seemed to hum with restrained fury, each glance between family members charged with unspoken accusation. And while the king presented his decision as an act of love and faith in the future, within the palace that night it felt more like the opening act of a bitter reckoning. As the fissures widened among the Windsors, another shocking revelation about the children's future training emerged, throwing the palace into deeper intrigue. As the king spoke of their training, few grasped the gravity of what lay ahead for George, Charlotte, and Louis. To the public, it sounded like a natural progression, a monarch preparing the next generation for their inevitable roles. But inside the palace, those who knew the truth exchanged uneasy glances, fully aware that what Charles envisioned was nothing short of a crucible. When he declared that the children's royal education would begin immediately, the words carried an unmistakable edge, one that signaled not just preparation but transformation and sacrifice. What followed was the unveiling of a program more secretive and more intense than any the royal family had ever dared to impose before. This was not simply etiquette lessons and ceremonial appearances. This was a regimen designed to harden, to shape, to test. Diplomacy and military training were to be woven together into an unrelenting schedule that would push each child to the brink. Behind the cameras, senior aides muttered about its brutality, calling it a forge meant to burn away anything soft. George, as heir apparent, was chosen to shadow global leaders, stepping silently into meetings with prime ministers and presidents, absorbing the art of negotiation and power dynamics before most boys, his age even understood the weight of responsibility. Charlotte, whose poise already eclipsed her years, was set on a path to spearhead international relations, mastering languages, learning protocol, and preparing to become the monarchy's secret weapon in delicate foreign affairs. But perhaps most unexpected was the role carved out for Louis. Known for his spirited antics in public, he was handed a task equally demanding to master the arts, charm, and emotional intelligence needed to unify a fractured public, becoming the monarchy's living embodiment of connection. Insiders spoke in hushed tones about the schedules being drawn up behind closed doors. Grueling days with no room for rebellion, no room for error. Some compared it to boot camp, others to a chessboard where even the youngest was being positioned for battle. It was whispered that William and Catherine had privately questioned whether such demands would destroy the very childhoods they had fought so hard to protect. One aide recalled Catherine asking late one evening, "What good is a throne if they have no childhood left to remember?" And yet, the children themselves seemed to understand the weight already being placed on their shoulders. As they left the announcement that night, their small figures retreating into the shadows, they wore steely expressions, their faces betraying neither fear nor defiance, only a quiet resolve. To some, it was a haunting glimpse of the rulers they would one day become, and a warning of the battles they would face long before coronation. But as the children disappeared into the palace for their first private briefing, the public outside erupted in scenes that no one could have predicted. From the streets of London to the farthest corners of the Commonwealth, reactions came fast, and they were anything but uniform. Outside Buckingham Palace, the air cracked with chants of "William, Kate," as thousands pressed against the gates, waving flags, singing, and shouting their names as if a new monarch had already been crowned. The energy was electric, raw with emotion, and steeped in relief for some, outrage for others. Social media ignited instantly, hashtags like #WalesEra and #ThankYouCharles, climbing to the top of global trends within minutes. Photos of the couple standing solemnly during Charles's announcement flooded timelines alongside video clips of the king's trembling hands. Yet among the cheers, there was dissent that could not be ignored. Protesters pushed through the jubilant throngs, carrying placards that read, "Too soon," and "Monarchy betrayed." They stood defiantly, accusing Charles of abandoning his duty too quickly, of giving in to personal weakness rather than royal strength. Others muttered bitterly about William and Catherine being handed power they had not yet earned. Loyalists in particular, those who had defended Charles during his hardest years, called his abdication a rupture of tradition that could not be mended. "The crown is not a gift to be passed at will," one shouted into a waiting camera, voice trembling with fury. And yet, even louder than these voices were those praising what had just unfolded. To many, it was a moment of courage, a graceful exit by a man who had spent his life waiting for a throne he never truly wanted. Supporters flooded comment sections and crowded squares with messages of respect, calling Charles's decision the ultimate act of humility. And for William and Catherine, the applause was deafening. People spoke of their authenticity, of their quiet service over the years, of the way they had weathered storms together without complaint. "They're already our king and queen," one woman declared through tears, her voice echoing the sentiment of thousands more. Beyond Britain's borders, the response was cautious, yet optimistic. Commonwealth leaders issued carefully worded statements offering thanks to Charles for his service, while expressing confidence in William and Catherine's ability to guide the monarchy forward. The Canadian Prime Minister spoke of a modern chapter, while Australia's leader called the moment a testament to continuity and progress. From Jamaica to New Zealand, messages poured in, some warm, others wary, but all acknowledging the seismic shift that had just taken place. Even as the world struggled to make sense of the scene, to choose sides between loyalty and renewal, one truth became impossible to deny: the monarchy would never again look the same. But even as Britain wrestled with this seismic shift, the focus shifted back to Catherine, whose quiet strength hid a storm brewing beneath. All eyes turned to Catherine, the woman now tasked with carrying the crown's heaviest secrets. In the wake of the announcement, as crowds roared and cameras flashed, she slipped quietly into a private chamber, leaving the noise behind. Those who followed said her shoulders sagged the moment the door closed, and for a few fleeting minutes, the weight of it all broke through her legendary composure. One aide overheard her whisper, almost to herself, "We must not fail them." The words hung in the air like a vow to her husband, her children, and a nation watching her every move. To the public, she was radiant, poised, unflinching. But behind the mask, palace insiders admitted she was still recovering from the deep exhaustion of her recent illness, a battle that had left her both physically weakened and emotionally raw. Friends revealed she had pushed herself back into the spotlight too soon, determined not to appear fragile at the very moment her family needed her most. Yet, in quiet moments, her hands trembled, and her smile faltered just enough for those closest to her to see the strain she carried. Adding to the burden was the quiet storm brewing between Catherine and Camilla. Tensions, long whispered about but never confirmed, flared behind the scenes as the two women clashed over ceremonial roles and public appearances in the days leading up to the abdication. Camilla reportedly insisted on maintaining her own visibility, refusing to step aside graciously, while Catherine fought to protect the dignity of her new position without igniting an outright feud. Their exchanges, aides say, were icy but controlled a silent duel between two queens in everything but name. Through it all, William remained her anchor. He was said to have found her alone that night, eyes red and distant, and knelt beside her to remind her of the promise they made to each other years ago, to walk through fire together, no matter the cost. Witnesses recalled his quiet words of reassurance, his hand over hers, as though he alone understood the storm churning beneath her calm exterior. That brief moment of intimacy, overheard only by a handful of trusted aides, reaffirmed to those watching that their bond remained unshakable even as the monarchy cracked around them. By the end of that long night, Catherine was already at work. Close friends revealed that she began drafting a roadmap for her children's reign before the sun rose. Notes, names, and strategies sketched hastily on scraps of paper. Even in her exhaustion, she was thinking 3 steps ahead, determined to ensure George, Charlotte, and Louis would inherit not just a throne, but a family and a nation still worth fighting for. And as Catherine steeled herself for the road ahead, Charles prepared to deliver one final, private message to his son. When the cameras stopped rolling, a father and son met alone, and what Charles told William left him visibly shaken. The noise outside had already begun to fade, swallowed by the thick walls of Buckingham Palace, but inside, an even heavier silence took hold. Charles summoned William to the Royal Library, a room steeped in history and secrets, its air dense with the weight of generations. Those who witnessed the summons said William walked slowly, almost reluctantly, toward the door, as though already sensing the gravity of what was waiting for him beyond it. Inside, what began as an embrace between father and son quickly shifted into something darker, something unspoken and impossible to ignore. For nearly an hour, they spoke in hushed tones, and though no one dared intrude, whispers from behind the heavy oak doors painted a chilling picture. When William finally emerged, his face was pale but set, his eyes carrying a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. One aide who caught his expression later described it as the look of a man who had just inherited more than he asked for. Rumors swirled almost immediately. Some claimed Charles had confessed truths so sensitive they could topple the monarchy if revealed undisclosed secrets about alliances within the family, private pacts with governments, and unnamed enemies lurking closer than anyone suspected. Others whispered about a hidden royal will, a document buried so deep in palace archives it had taken Charles months to locate, containing instructions for handling not just the smooth passage of power, but the inevitable storms of dissent that would follow. One source claimed the king even warned his son to expect betrayal from within, to guard his family not only from outsiders but from their own blood. The meeting ended with an embrace so tight, one aide swore they saw Charles's fingers dig into William's shoulder as though he couldn't bear to let go. Those nearby heard him whisper low and urgent, "Protect them all, even from themselves." It was less a blessing than a command, loaded with unspoken fear, a warning passed like a torch that burned even as it illuminated. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. Charles retreated into his private quarters, the door closing behind him with a finality that silenced even the whispers. William stood alone in the corridor, staring into the night through a narrow window, as though searching for something beyond the palace walls. Whatever had passed between them in that room, it was clear that William now carried a burden even heavier than the crown itself, a burden of secrets that could either save his family or destroy it. And so, with the past handed down and the future teetering on the edge, the stage was set for the most audacious royal chapter yet. With the king gone and the crown unofficially theirs, William and Catherine step into history, but what awaits them may test the monarchy to its core. The balcony doors opened, and they emerged with their children at their sides, greeted by a roar from the crowd below, so thunderous it seemed to shake the palace itself. For a moment, the family stood motionless, letting the wave of sound wash over them, before raising their hands in unison to acknowledge the thousands of faces staring up with equal parts devotion and expectation. This was no ordinary wave. This was the signal of a new era, the Wales era beginning not in quiet ceremony but with a defiant, triumphant declaration that the monarchy was still alive, still capable of reinventing itself. Observers called it electrifying. Analysts rushed to their cameras and microphones to declare that a turning point had arrived steeped in both promise and peril. The newspapers would christen the moment the dawn of Wales, but beneath the pageantry and pride, there was an undercurrent of unease. Unanswered questions about the abdication's true cause hung thick in the air, whispered between royal watchers, and shouted from protesters who hadn't forgotten how sudden, how strange, it had all seemed. Speculation grew as the family waved. Speculation that even this new dawn was shadowed by secrets no amount of cheering could drown out. And inside the palace, the storm had not yet passed. Tension simmered among those sidelined in the shuffle, the royals whose roles had been diminished, the courtiers who had staked their careers on a different future, the old guard who now watched with growing resentment as William and Catherine claimed the stage. Behind their smiles, enemies still lurked, waiting for cracks to form. Whispers of betrayal, of hidden agendas, of feuds not yet settled, coiled through the corridors like smoke. Even here, even now, nothing in the monarchy was ever as simple as it appeared. Yet at that moment on the balcony, none of that mattered to the crowds below. The children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, stood at their parents' sides, perfectly still, embodying everything fragile yet unbreakable about the monarchy's future. Their presence, small yet symbolic, reminded everyone watching that this family was not just stepping into history, but carrying the weight of it forward on young shoulders, already too burdened. Then, as the first fireworks exploded above the palace, the night sky lit up in brilliant flashes of gold and crimson. The roar of the crowd swelled once more, and from somewhere deep in the throng, a single phrase rose and spread, carried by countless voices until it thundered across the square, "God save the King and Queen." But as history has taught us, every beginning hides its own shadows, and the story of Britain's royal family is far from over. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.